Welcome back to Sad Crime. Today you'll hear about events that took place in New York City in 1995. Kimberly Antonakos was born in 1974 in New York. When she was just a year old, her parents divorced, and initially she lived with her mother, spending weekends with her father, Tom. Kimberly was an only child, and her bond with her father was very strong. Tom adored his daughter and would do anything for her. When Kimberly's mother decided to move to Florida, Kimberly chose to stay in New York with her dad. Tom was a businessman who had previously worked in real estate and insurance, and by the early 1990s, he owned a successful computer sales company. At that time, computers were still relatively new and highly sought after, so the Antonakos family never lacked money. In 1994, Kimberly felt it was time to become independent. She believed she was mature enough to live on her own. At the time, she was studying and also working, which allowed her to support herself. Of course, she still knew she could count on her dad for financial help if needed. Tom preferred she continue living with him, but after some persuasion, he agreed to her moving out. They looked at several apartments together, and eventually, Kimberly decided to rent one in Brooklyn, close to her best friend's home. It was important to her that the apartment had 2 bedrooms, as one was meant for her mother if she ever came to visit. Tom made sure his daughter would be safe in her new home by installing an alarm system and buying her a beeper and a mobile phone. Back in 1994, buying a mobile phone was quite expensive, but for Tom, nothing was more valuable than his daughter's safety. To further ensure her security, Tom also rented a garage directly across the street from her apartment, so Kimberly wouldn't have to park her car far from home. She used the garage for her white Honda Accord, which she had received as a birthday gift from her father. Even though Kimberly no longer lived with her father, they maintained close contact, speaking on the phone every day. Once a week they would go out for dinner, and every Sunday they would visit Tom's mother together. At the beginning of 1995, Kimberly's friend, who lived just a few blocks away, asked for a favor. Her apartment was being renovated, and she, her partner, and their child needed a place to stay for about 2 weeks. Kimberly had no problem letting them stay with her. Soon, her friend April, Joshua, and their 3-year-old son moved in. On February 28, 1995, Kimberly planned to spend the evening at a club with her friend Liz. They met at Kimberly's apartment, where they got ready together. Once their nails were painted, hair done, and outfits chosen, they got into Kimberly's car and headed to the club. However, they were disappointed with the night out, as they didn't meet anyone interesting. By 3 a.m., they decided it was time to head home. Kimberly dropped Liz off at her apartment and then drove back toward her own. As she parked her car in the garage, she was ambushed by 2 men. They pulled her from the car, covered her eyes and mouth with tape, bound her hands, and shoved her into the trunk of her car. One of the men got into her Honda Accord, while the other drove off in his own vehicle. Neither of the men knew Kimberly personally, but they were acting on orders from an acquaintance who knew she was the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Their plan was to kidnap her and demand a $75,000 ransom from her father for her release. They were confident that Thomas Antonakos would pay any amount to save his daughter. The mastermind behind the plan dreamed of using the ransom money to buy himself a new Infiniti car. To them, the plan seemed foolproof. The 2 kidnappers took Kimberly to an abandoned house that their acquaintance had previously scoped out. A few weeks earlier, he noticed the building was vacant, broke in, and managed to steal a spare set of keys. Since then, he had occasionally used the house for secret gatherings with friends. It seemed like the perfect place to hold Kimberly. The men took her to the basement, tied her to a chair, and left her there with her mouth and eyes still taped shut. They even removed her shoes so she wouldn't be able to make noise by stomping her feet on the floor to get attention. Cold and bound, Kimberly was left alone in the basement. It was March 1st, and the temperature outside was quite low, dropping to 1 to 2 degrees Celsius 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit at night. While the house had a thermostat set to 12 degrees Celsius and 54 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent the pipes from freezing, the basement was certainly much colder. When Kimberly didn't show up to work on March 1st, her supervisor, who was also a friend of Thomas Antonakos, called him to ask if he knew why she hadn't come in. Kimberly had never missed work without notifying someone in advance. Tom was shocked by the news and immediately rushed to her apartment, but she wasn't there. Inside, only April, Joshua, and their child were home. Tom didn't know them personally, but he was aware they were temporarily staying with Kimberly. They told him that Kimberly had not returned home after the night out, and they were also beginning to worry. Tom reported his daughter's disappearance to the police, providing them with all the information he had gathered. He was very upset, convinced that something terrible had happened to his daughter, and tried to persuade the police of this. Seeing his determination, the police filed a missing person report, even though Kimberly was an adult and could theoretically have gone anywhere without informing anyone. Tom wasn't content to sit and wait for the police to act. His first move was to return to Kim's apartment to check the garage and see if her car was there. The car was missing, but he found a gold earring on the garage floor. When Tom shared this with investigators, they first showed it to Liz to confirm if Kim had been wearing it the previous night. Liz confirmed with absolute certainty. She had been with Kim while they got ready for the evening. The police now knew that Kimberly had made it to the garage but disappeared along with her car. But was it her they were after, or the car? What had happened? Detectives began searching for Kim's car, while Tom, on his own, did everything he could to find her. He put up posters about her disappearance, questioned people on the streets if they had seen his daughter, and even handed out half of a $50 bill, promising to give the other half to anyone who provided information about Kim. Sadly, no one came forward. No one knew anything. The police informed Tom that, given his wealth, it was possible his daughter had been kidnapped for ransom. They advised him to pay attention to any letters or calls he received. However, Tom never received a ransom letter. His answering machine did record 2 messages, but upon investigation, they turned out to be silent calls. No one spoke on the line. Joshua, the man temporarily staying in Kim's apartment, was particularly helpful in the search for her. He contacted mutual friends to check if she was with them, but no one had any information. The only person he couldn't reach was a man who went by the nickname Psycho, someone who had previously shown romantic interest in Kim, though she wasn't interested in him. Joshua had a criminal record and connections in the underworld, and he knew several places where stolen cars were often dumped. He took Tom to these locations, hoping to find Kim's Honda, but the car was nowhere to be found. 2 days after Kim's disappearance, Tom informed her mother of the situation. He hadn't wanted to worry her before, thinking they would find Kim quickly. Marlene flew in from Florida as soon as she could. Once there, she wasn't sure how to help with the search. It seemed Tom had already done everything possible. Desperate, she decided to consult a psychic for clues. The psychic told her that Kim was alive but needed to be found quickly as she was in danger. On March 4th, the fire department received a call about a fire at an abandoned house in Queens, a different part of New York. After the fire was extinguished, firefighters found partially burned remains in the basement. The body had tape on its eyes and mouth, and the person had clearly been tied up. Though the face was charred, the firefighters could tell from the body that it was a woman. The entire basement smelled strongly of gasoline, reinforcing the belief that this was an intentional arson. Police officers who arrived at the scene found it difficult to recover any evidence, as the fire had destroyed most of it. The perpetrator knew exactly what they were doing. Identifying the victim wasn't easy, but despite the burns, 2 tattoos were visible: a scorpion on her hip and an infinity symbol made of 2 naked figures on her lower back. These tattoos helped confirm that the victim was Kimberly Antonakos. Later that same day, her father officially identified her remains. It was his daughter. But why had she been killed? And in such a horrific manner? Why wasn't she released after the ransom was paid, as the plan had intended? The plan had seemed so simple and foolproof. However, not everything had gone according to plan. After Kimberly's body was found, detectives managed to track down the man called Psycho, whom Joshua had mentioned several times. Psycho still hadn't returned Joshua's calls, which seemed suspicious. Psycho, originally from Russia, had moved to New York with his parents as a child. Unfortunately, he became involved with a Russian-Spanish gang and had a deep obsession with Kim, leading investigators to believe he could be the culprit. However, when he was arrested and informed of Kim's death, his reaction led detectives to believe they had the wrong man. He was genuinely devastated by the news, and his emotional response seemed authentic. Investigators took him to the crime scene to gauge his reaction, and they became even more certain that he was not the person responsible. The search for the real culprit continued. 5 days after Kimberly's body was discovered, the police finally found her car. It was parked about 12 miles away from where the crime had taken place, on a quiet, secluded street. Investigators hoped the vehicle would hold clues that could lead them to the culprit. However, the car had been meticulously cleaned, with no fingerprints or any other evidence. The only thing they found was an earring in the trunk, identical to the one discovered in the garage. Although finding her car seemed like it might be a breakthrough, it didn't contribute much to the investigation. It was another dead end. Tom, who had been frantically searching for his daughter before her body was found, was now just as desperately trying to find out who was responsible for her death. He stopped working altogether, spending his days standing in front of the house where Kimberly had been discovered, asking passersby for any information. No one knew anything. No one had seen or heard anything that could help lead to the killer. One neighbor admitted to hearing strange noises, almost like groaning, but thought they were coming from the neighbors, who often had noisy parties. Another woman, who lived nearby and walked her dog past the abandoned house, said that for 2 days, her dog would stop and bark incessantly at the house. But she knew no one lived there, so she always pulled the dog away. If only these 2 people hadn't ignored the signs, Kimberly might have been saved. The most heart-wrenching part, though, was that the son of the owner of the abandoned house had come by on March 3rd, as he did every first Friday of the month, to pick up the mail. He noticed that someone had broken in and that the spare keys were missing, but he didn't think much of it. He took what he needed and left. All the while, Kimberly was tied up in the basement, so close to being rescued. But let's go back to the kidnappers. What exactly went wrong, leading to such a tragic ending? After locking Kim in the basement, one of the men was supposed to take care of her, bringing her food and water twice a day and making sure she had a blanket to stay warm during the cold days and even colder nights. For some reason, likely fear of getting caught, he never returned to the house. Kimberly was left tied up in that cold basement for 3 days, without food or water. She was starving, thirsty, and worse, her body temperature was dropping rapidly. The freezing conditions caused her body to go into hypothermia. She drifted in and out of consciousness. During this time, the kidnappers were oblivious to how bad her condition had become. The mastermind of the plan tried to contact Kimberly's father to demand a ransom. He recorded his demands on a tape recorder and called Tom's landline. When he heard Tom's voice, he immediately played the recording. When the message finished, he waited for a response but heard nothing. Confused, he hung up and called again, repeating the process, but still, there was only silence after the recording ended. The man didn't understand what was happening. Why was Tom so indifferent? Why wasn't he reacting? Frustrated, he decided to wait. He had sent his message. Now it was Tom's turn to respond. Maybe he needed more time. Perhaps he was in shock and didn't know what to say. It never crossed the kidnapper's mind that Tom had never heard the message because the voice he heard was an answering machine greeting, playing at the same time the kidnapper was playing his own recording. No message was ever recorded, just silence. Those 2 empty messages were what Tom listened to shortly after Kimberly disappeared. He never received the ransom demands. If he had, he would have paid whatever they asked, even if it meant selling his house or car. Nothing was worth more to him than Kimberly. After 3 days without a response from Tom, the kidnappers decided there was no point in dragging it out any longer. They needed to release her. But when they arrived at the house, Kimberly showed no signs of life. Her skin was blue, and there was no pulse. They nudged her, then started lightly kicking her, but she didn't move. At first they panicked, unsure what to do, but the man who had planned the entire kidnapping decided they needed to cover their tracks, and the best way to do that was to burn the house down. They went to a gas station, bought fuel, doused Kimberly and the entire basement with gasoline, and set it on fire. Kimberly's autopsy later revealed that she was still alive when the fire started. Smoke was found in her lungs, meaning she had been breathing when the flames engulfed her. The kidnappers had mistaken the effects of hypothermia, pale skin and a weak pulse for death. For 6 months there were no new developments in the case. Then, in July, when someone was arrested for an unrelated burglary, they provided police with information about Kimberly's kidnapping. This person said they had overheard a man bragging about how he and his friends had kidnapped and burned a woman. That man was Joshua Torres, the same Joshua who had been dating Kimberly's best friend and living in Kimberly's apartment. The man who had so eagerly helped Tom search for Kimberly was later interrogated. He denied any involvement in her murder, claiming he treated her like a sister and would never be capable of such a thing. However, during the questioning, investigators picked up on something telling. When asked if he had kidnapped Kim, he responded, "If I had done it, I would have fed her." This was significant because the fact that Kimberly had been starved was never made public. Only the police knew. The only way Joshua could have known was if he had been involved in the abduction. Still, the investigators needed solid proof to tie him to the crime. Shortly after Joshua's interrogation, his ex-girlfriend, known as Blondie, came forward. She had detailed knowledge about the kidnapping, as Joshua had told her everything. She also provided the names of the 2 others involved, 19-year-old Nicholas Libretti and 26-year-old Jose Negrin, who had helped abduct Kimberly from the garage. By the time the police learned the identities of the two kidnappers, Jose Negron was already dead. On June 22nd, he had been shot in the head on the street, likely by Joshua Torres. Jose had been cautious and didn't fully trust Joshua. After Kimberly's kidnapping, he secretly recorded their meetings to have evidence that Joshua had orchestrated the crime. Consumed with guilt over Kimberly's death, Jose couldn't live with what they had done. Joshua was aware of Jose's guilt and feared he might go to the police, so he killed him to silence him. When Nicholas Libretti was questioned, he quickly admitted to being involved. According to him, the kidnapping had been Joshua's idea. Joshua knew Kimberly through his girlfriend, April, who was Kimberly's best friend. He knew Kimberly came from a wealthy family, and that her father would have no trouble raising the ransom. When Joshua moved into Kimberly's apartment, he learned her daily routine and knew when she would leave the house. The plan was simple, but one small mistake led to a terrible tragedy. Despite Nicholas' detailed confession, Joshua continued to insist he was innocent, claiming that Nicholas was lying. The investigators had a clear understanding of the crime, but New York law prevented them from using one accomplice's testimony against another in court. Nicholas' statement couldn't be used as evidence in Joshua's trial. Blondie was also a potential witness, but she had since had run-ins with the law, making her an unreliable source. However, investigators found another person with information about the crime who was willing to testify, Julio Negron. Although he wasn't related to Jose Negron, he knew about the kidnapping. On the night Nicholas and Joshua set the house on fire, Julio had been waiting in the car, ready to help them flee the scene. His testimony matched Nicholas' account and confirmed that Joshua had admitted to killing Jose. During Joshua Torres' trial in October 1996, further evidence showed that Joshua had not called anyone after Kimberly's disappearance, despite telling her father that he had reached out to friends to try and find her. He had even mentioned trying to contact someone named Psycho, but phone records proved he never made the call. It was a diversion attempt to throw the investigation off course. After deliberating for 10 hours, the jury found Joshua Torres guilty of Kimberly Antonakos' murder. However, there wasn't enough evidence to convict him for the death of Jose Negron. Joshua was sentenced to 58 years in prison and won't be eligible for parole until 2045. To this day, he maintains his innocence. Following Joshua's trial, Nicholas Libretti was also sentenced to 58 years in prison. However, he didn't serve his full sentence, as he died in 1999 at the age of 23, after just 2 years behind bars. Julio Negron received a much lighter sentence of 2 years in prison for his role in the crime. Thomas Antonakos, Kimberly's father, was satisfied with the sentences handed down to the criminals. He didn't wish for the death penalty, believing that spending the rest of their lives in prison was a harsher punishment. Thomas frequently visited his daughter's grave but sadly passed away from lung cancer in 2005. In the end, justice was served, though it could never truly heal the wounds left by such a senseless tragedy. Kimberly's light was extinguished far too soon, but her memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. Her father, Thomas, though devastated, found solace in knowing that those responsible for her death would face the consequences of their actions. Thomas's love for Kimberly never wavered, even as he battled his own illness. He spent his final years visiting her grave, keeping her spirit alive in the only way he knew how. His quiet strength and unwavering dedication became a symbol of a father's undying love. And with that, this story comes to an end. Thank you for listening to it in full. Until next time.